Welcome, Dr. Scagnelli. I will flip it to you so we can get this going.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining. So the purpose of today's webinar is to talk about what's happening in the therapeutic space for multiple sclerosis with regards to fingolimod. So fingolimod, which was formerly, I guess, still currently the generic name for the commercial product Gilenya, has become a fully generic product. And at the end of 2023, at the end of this calendar year, the brand Gilenya will no longer be supported. And as is the case with drugs that come off their patent, the fingolimod compound will be made by a variety of pharmaceutical outlets in a generic form. And so you can see here, there are about 13 different manufacturers of generic fingolimod out there. These manufacturing locations are in China and India. You can see that the appearance of the pills, if you look to the right, will all be quite different. And you can see here the holders of the applicant and the manufacturers of these products. And so this certainly raises some concerns for those of us who treat patients with multiple sclerosis. Potentially, and the main purpose of today's talk is to discuss the possibility of switching patients to a new commercially available product called Texenzo. So we're going to get a little bit in the details about drug development today. This is, actually a pretty interesting topic when you think about how drugs come to market and then what happens when generic substitutions come into the marketplace. And so the brand name Gilenya, which was made by and still is made by Novartis Pharmaceuticals, is listed in the left or the middle column of this chart, and on the right is the generic forms of fingolimod. So the drug substance for each of these compounds is still fingolimide hydrochloride, and so we are still talking about the same active ingredient. Within the generic class for this 505J ANDA class, the drug product also has to have the same inactive ingredients, these generic drugs will also be delivered through by a capsule. When we think about how the drug comes to market, that's where the differences really begin. And so from a pharmacologic sense, these, Gilenya endured a multi-phase rigorous clinical trial to come to market, including proof of concept, proof of dose, and proof of efficacy and safety. Once a compound is approved by the FDA, when a generic comes onto market, and sometimes, and we'll talk about this later, where a biosimilar comes to market, what has to be done is a bioequivalence study demonstrating the same pharmacokinetics as the reference listed drug. And so this is to avoid the need to do large randomized controlled studies on generic drugs. I mean, the purpose of a drug moving from a commercial product to a generic drug is that the generic drug should be, and almost always is, a cheaper drug. And that helps to bring the overall price of healthcare dollars down for both patients and insurers and society. So, of course, as part of this program, a commercially available product like Gilenya underwent, again, these rigorous clinical studies, and the generic drugs, that is not required. I think most most concerning to me is that patients not only would be on a generic form of the drug, but also can be switched amongst the generics. So if I showed it in the past slide, I showed about 13 different generic drugs, patients could conceivably be switched from month to month to month amongst these different generics, basically as the pharmacy filling the script sees fit to change the drug. So I think it's important to not rag on generic medications. We use generic medications in many parts of human disease. Blood pressure medications are nearly all generic. Cholesterol medications, diabetes medications, many of these drugs have become generic medications and are commonly used throughout society. They have the same form and dose form as the brand, and they have to prove bioequivalence in order to get onto the market. The Office of Generic Drug does review the chemistry, the manufacturing, the controls, and pharmacokinetics of these medications. But there is no additional safety or efficacy data required to bring these drugs onto the marketplace. And there can be differences. And so these differences are real and can cause therapeutic gaps or mishaps for patients. And so there is the difference in absorption, and this is allowed by the FDA in between generics and brand name medications can be 3.5%, and that's in either direction. And so there is conceivably a 7% switch or shift in absorption ability between one generic medication and another generic medication, thereby again bringing up this concern that I have and others have about switching from generic to generic to generic throughout the lifespan of someone taking a chronic medication. So at this point, we have this data to look at the Gilenya patients. Gilenya came off patent at the end of 2022. And so you can see here on the top line, Gilenya patients or Gilenya dollars, right? So US sales of Gilenya have gone from $354 million in Q1 of 2021. And in Q1 of 2023, down to $80 million. So there has been a significant drop in patients taking Gilenya since the drug went off patent. You can see some growth within the other S1P space over the time, over the 2 years that this data is shown. You can see a drop off in drugs like Avonex, going basically in half. There's stability in other products and growth in other areas, like in our monoclonal antibodies. And so you can see the expansion in the Kesimpta dollars and also the Ocrevus dollars over that period of time. On the bottom, you can see 2 drugs that have also become generic or on their way to becoming generic, Aubagio and Copaxone, and we can see that there's been a drop off in the use of those drugs as well. And so overall, when we think about Gilenya, the sale of Gilenya has declined by about 75%. Now, I don't have data looking at generic Fingolimod on this slide. So why are we having this conversation? We're having this conversation because we are heading into the end of 2023. At the end of 2023, Fingolimod product support will come to an end. And your patients on Gilenya will likely need to be switched to another product. And one of the great issues with these medications is that these specialty medications, these disease-modifying therapies, are quite expensive. And so most patients are receiving copay support to afford their medication. And that copay support will come to an end. Many of my patients and many of your patients have probably already been switched, or and their insurances have demanded a switch to generic Fingolimod. This has happened in my clinic with little or no warning for many patients. In fact, in many cases, patients have been told that I have approved a switch, and I have not done that. But there are patients who have already switched to generic Fingolimod. These patients are receiving really little or no support for their generic medication. And I think, the decline in the Gilenya sales that we've seen from the previous slide suggests that many patients have made that switch. Now, there are some products that have some limited copay support, and it's a little unclear if that will endure past the year. It's unclear if those support structures are in place while Novartis is still providing that support for Gilenya, and whether that will sunset at the end of the year as well. And as we all know in medical billing, patients can receive bills well after service is rendered and well after product is consumed. And so while patients may not have been asked for anything out of pocket right now, it is conceivable that they would get a bill in the mail later, and that is would be hard to recoup. So I did mention that there are some generic companies that are providing some copay offerings, and so Apotex, Accord, and Dr. Reddy's Laboratories are offering some assistance for patients. And so this represents only about a quarter of these generic companies. So let's talk now about non-medical switching. I made an allusion to this earlier, that some of my patients have been switched from Gilenya to generic Fingolimod without my consent or my order or my prescription. This is a well-recognized practice in the generic space. So this is called non-medical switching. And so this is the practice of switching treatment in patients with stable disease for non-clinical reasons. And so the switch could happen without your consent or with your patients really understanding what they're consenting to. Patients, don't necessarily read who's manufacturing their medications. This is an issue for neurologic patients in that we have very complex patients and may be vulnerable to consequences of non-medical switching. One of the great areas where this has been an issue has been in the epilepsy world, where patients' therapeutic range for their medications can be quite narrow. And so these shifts in bioavailability of generic medications, where I mentioned there could be a 7%, or I think in the epilepsy world, I've heard a 10% variance between generic products, has major clinical impact on some patients and leads to breakthrough seizures in some patients. And so I and others share those concerns in the MS world, where we have fairly well-defined dosing, and could certainly imagine a case where someone who is used to receiving 0.5 milligrams of Fingolimod receiving less than that and having breakthrough disease. So the other issue with non-medical switching is that that if a patient is moving from a product with copay assistance, even if that product is more expensive, to a quote unquote less expensive medication, if there is no copay assistance for that less expensive medication, the patient's out-of-pocket expense will likely be greater. Cheaper cheaper medications are great political talking points, but sometimes this is not the case in our medical, in our society with our medical system. So, one thing to recognize is that we may, at the end of the year or the beginning of 24, see a big storm of these patients. And that's why it's important for us to be having this conversation now, is that there could be a whole number of patients calling you with the same issue of being on a generic, not having copay support, not being able to afford their medications. This is a huge concern for Fingolimod because, as we know, Fingolimod, when removed from the body, can lead to severe MS relapses. And so there have been reports, I have seen it, I've had severe consequences in some of my patients who have had immune reconstitution syndromes related to the cessation of Fingolimod. And so this could cause major issues in the MS space. So to try to alleviate this, Cycle Pharma has introduced a oral disintegrating Fingolimod to the market. And so this drug is commercially available by the name Texenzo. Texenzo is available in two forms, 0.25 milligram and 0.5 milligram. And so this is providing for me and for others an ability to switch patients over from brand Gilenya over to brand Texenzo, keeping people on the same compound, and keeping them on a commercial product where they can receive copay assistance. So we're encouraging people to be proactive about this by having these conversations with their patients now, rather than waiting for the inevitable situation where they will be on a generic, and that conversation will be more challenging to go from a generic medication back to a brand medication. So what is this? What is Texenzo ODT? So Texenzo ODT is Fingolimod. It is not a generic. It is a commercially available product. It has been able to come to the market because of the different dosing form. And so the form of this drug is an oral disintegrating tablet that may also have benefits for some patients who have difficulty swallowing drugs. This oral disintegrating form may be a better option for them as well. This is not substitutable at the pharmacy level. So this non-medical switching that occurs in the generic world should not and cannot occur for Texenzo ODT. Texenzo ODT was proven through bioequivalent data to demonstrate lymphocyte and heart rate equivalence to Gilenya. And so this is a bit different than running PK data. PK data really just shows that you have same concentration of Gilenya. This is a little more rigorous than that data. It's manufactured in the UK, and it is accompanied by a patient support program called Cycle Vita, available as 0.25 and 0.5 milligram orally disintegrating tablets. So now we're kind of adding in here in the middle Texenzo to this chart that we saw earlier. And so we see here that Texenzo is slightly different in that it's Fingolimod lauryl sulfate. It's available as an oral disintegrating tablet. there is, there was bioequivalence done for this drug. And then we did do pharmacodynamic and safety data for Texenzo. And so the drug cannot be switched by a pharmacist. Cyclovita is the patient support network that is delivered through Cyclepharma. Cyclovita will provide in-home first dose observation and baseline assessments for patients starting on Texenzo. It is there is a compliance program, a dedicated case manager program, and a bridge program available, and that bridge is quite important. So again, one of my biggest concerns with Fingolimod is patients who cease taking Fingolimod for a period of time because they can't afford or can't have access to their medication. And previously, this was mitigated by Novartis Pharmaceuticals providing bridge drug to patients who couldn't get coverage through their insurance company or couldn't pay for the drug. This will not be available with the generic forms of Fingolimod. Texenzo will provide bridge drug to patients who are eligible to provide this safety net for those patients. Cyclovita is offering a $0 copay assistance program, and are also providing support for the research space. Well, I am going to stop there.